We have here today Gil Bailie from Cornerstone Forum from Sonoma, California, who has agreed to share with us his thoughts and memories on Professor René Girard. And I would like to start off by asking you, Gil, we've known each other for quite a while now, and it goes back all the way to 1990s. That's when I met you at CSAC meetings and then cover. So when did you first hear about René Girard and what drew you to him?
Well, I first discovered him. I was browsing in the bookstore at the University of California, Berkeley bookstore, and there was a sale table, and there was a book on the sale table named Violence and the Sacred. And it was by René Girard. And I had seen his name in footnotes, but I didn't know anything else about him. But the title, Violence and the Sacred, struck me. So I got the book and brought it home. And I read probably the first 10 or 20 pages. And instinctively, I knew that this man had broken the code. I mean, it was just hit me like a ton of bricks. And it took me a long time to absorb that book and to understand it. But it took me 20 minutes to realize that this was a groundbreaking work. So I began to read everything I get my hands on.
Let me stop you. How long did it take you to digest Violence and the Sacred?
Oh, I don't know. I'm a slow plodding reader, and especially when I'm reading something I really, really like, I go at a snail's pace. So it took me a long time. But meanwhile, I was searching and accumulating his books and things about him and so on and so forth. But the truth is, Babak, I didn't know if he was dead or alive, if he was in this country or France. I was, it was just his thought that struck me. And then the next thing that struck me was a bolt of lightning. There was a biblical exegetes conference to be held in my little town, and the organizer in Sonoma.
Wow!
Here because the organizer lived here, and I knew him. And he was not orthodox in any sense, and he smelled orthodoxy when it came to Girard. So he wasn't interested in Girard, but he called me up out of the blue, and he said, I know you're interested in Girard, and 15 or 20 of these biblical scholars that are coming in for the conference have convinced Girard to come up from Stanford to spend the day with them, talking about the implications of his work for biblical studies. And I thought I'd been hit by lightning. I mean, I'm not an academic. I had a little institute where I was teaching, Dante and Shakespeare and that sort of thing. And the next thing I know, he came to spend a day in my office. So Bob says, I can't hold this place. I don't have a place for it. Can we hold it in your office? I said, you bet. So he came, and I've told this story many times, but it's worth telling again.
Absolutely.
He began the day with a lecture, kind of an informal lecture. He spoke for 45 minutes or an hour, and these biblical scholars were amazed at what he laid out. It was a kind of a panorama they hadn't seen, and there was a kind of a silence in the room. One of them raised his hand, and he said, Professor Girard, it almost seems as though, in your eyes, biblical literature is categorically superior to all other literature in terms of its revelatory power. But he said, you're not saying that. I mean, you're a Stanford professor. You're not saying that, are you? And René said, categorically. And that warmed my heart because there was not a biblical scholar in the room that would have said that.
Right.
And then the rest of the day was just so rich, give and take. At the end of the day, there was another moment. One of the attendees raised his hand. And by the way, as you know, René's work, there's a very powerful apocalyptic dimension to his work. And it came out in what he was saying. It's as though.
Let me slow you down. What year was this? Do you remember
it was in the mid to late 80s. I don't remember exactly.
Late 80s, okay.
So then he kept on, and it was just the richest feast imaginable. At the end of the day, another one of the biblical scholars raised his hand, especially because of this apocalyptic dimension, which by the way, let me just say something about that. Let me encapsulate it.
Sure.
The apocalyptic dimension of René's work is that the revelation of the cross begins the deconstruction of the system for containing violence. The old system for getting violence out of the community by blaming it on a scapegoat. The revelation of the cross is there's a victim who is so innocent. He's not innocent in the way that any of us human beings could be innocent. He's not morally innocent, just morally innocent. He's ontologically innocent. And it took ontological innocence to shatter that powerful mechanism that had been operating for thousands and thousands of years and continues to operate this day. But once it's broken, we keep resorting to it, but every time we resort to it, we cripple it the more. So it gobbles up more and more victims and becomes like a loose cannon. So in René, and I'm putting words in his mouth, but it's apocalyptic in the sense that after that revelation, there's a race going on between the effect of the gospel, which is to break that mechanism down. You know, I didn't come to bring peace but a sword, because he's going to take that mechanism away for restoring peace on the cheap by blaming on a scapegoat. The effect of the gospel is to take that mechanism away. There's a race between that and the message of the gospel, and the message of the gospel is how to live without it, how to turn the other cheek, forgive 7 times, 70 times, and so on. So this is an apocalyptic element in René's work. Well, it was brought out in that day. At the end of the day, one of the biblical scholars says, he was kind of blown away by it. He said, Professor Girard, this is really quite a monumental thing you've brought out here today. What are we going to do about it? You know, we Americans, we want to fix it. And René, and Babak, you remember René? I could almost mimic him. You know, he's a very humble guy, and so what are we going to do about it? And René said, well, I don't know. It's a big issue, and we're all called to different things. So, but in answer to your question, maybe we should all begin with personal sanctity. I thought, this is my man. Why don't we begin with personal sanctity? So that's the first day I met René.
That's amazing. And he didn't even define what personal sanctity meant.
No, he just left it sitting there.
Yeah. Were the scholars Catholic, or were they Catholic and Protestants alike?
Oh, it was mostly Protestants. There were some Catholics, okay. But it was a very liberal biblical exegesis group, okay. Which means it was mostly Protestant.
I see.
But they were good people, or they wouldn't have been drawn to that meeting.
Right.
And many of them became very close friends of mine over, later as we gathered around in the things we did at Stanford that you know about.
Right. So, so then how did your relationship develop with Renee? Was it a
Well,
professional relationship or was it a friendship relationship?
it was mostly a personal friendship relationship. But fools rush in where angels fear to tread. It became clear to me when I first began to associate with Renee and some of the people in the seminar there at Stanford. It became clear to me that there was an intellectual embargo on Renee's work because he was a Christian. Things hidden since the foundation of the world made it perfectly clear that he was a Christian. With violence unveiled, I mean not violence, with the violence in the sacred, it was there was no sense of Christianity in it. You could read, if you knew it, you would see it. And so people thought it was an atheistic analysis of culture.
Right.
But with things hidden, it became
hidden.
clear as Christian. And then suddenly the embargo went up. It was not. It was, everybody was kind of moving away from him. The academic world was. So I thought to myself, well, look, I'm not an academic. I'll try to write a book that outflanks the embargo and just gets it out there to everybody. So I was working away on that, and I kept going down either for the seminar or to visit with Renee. And I remember one time towards the end when I was getting the manuscript ready, I had lunch with Renee at the faculty club at Stanford, and I said, Renee, I started to write this book because I wanted to I know that there's an embargo, or that somehow your Christianity has made it hard for the academic world to come to grips with your work. I said, unfortunately, my book is going to make it all the worse because my book is so totally Christian. and René leaned over the table. He leaned over the table and he said, "Let's burn our ships on the beach." So anyway, and then I had the privilege of attending the seminars, and you were part of that as well.
Right.
For quite a few years, and I got to know René and his wife Martha quite well, and I learned so much from him that cannot be accounted for intellectually, because it wasn't intellectual. I learned from his spirit. I attended mass with him. I ate at his home. I visited him. Even after when he was declining, he had some strokes. He couldn't talk, or very hardly at all. And I would sit with him when I was able to get down for a little visit. I would sit with him and hold his hand, and neither one of us would speak. He would always have a big smile. Every time, and I don't know, maybe this is true of everybody who ever saw him. He's such a gracious person. But every time I came to see him, whether it was in his office or in a seminar, he always had a big beaming smile.
Absolutely.
Oh, Gil, he says, that was that kind of a person. It was and for me, my father was killed in the Battle of the Bulge, so I grew up without a father, and I told René this, especially when he was declining. I said to him, "You may think that your contribution has already been made," but I said to him, the graciousness with which you are coming to grips with your incapacities is a witness to me of how to accept the infirmities of age graciously and with faith. And it really was. It was a treasure. Those, I mean, as much as I loved being in that seminar and just embracing the wisdom that he exuded, the the sheer goodness of the man was a great blessing to me in his later years.
Right. So you were with him till his last days, essentially.
Well, I was with him within I would say the month or a few weeks. I don't remember exactly now,
But 2015, essentially, when he passed away.
yes,
Right.
yeah.
So in all these years, Gil, would you say he had an impact on you spiritually as well? I guess that's what you were talking
Absolutely. One of the things, I mean, it seems a little self-referential to put it this way, but one of the things that René always complimented me about is that I'm not an academic.
about.
He said, you know, he said, that's what I like about you. You're not, and I, let me tell you something. I come with all the liabilities that go with that. You know, I learned by the seat of my pants. I really do. So he knew that there were shortcomings, but he said he liked that. And because of that, partly because of that, we talked religion. And and so we had, I think I had as good a feel for his faith as any of his students, as any of his all of us who regard ourselves as having been personally affected by him, because we had conversations about those things.
Wonderful.
And I know how deep his faith was. He was not a theologian, didn't want to be a theologian, had, you know, he could have problems with theologians, probably because they had problems with him because they thought he was, you know, an interloper on their territory or something. But I'll tell you, he had the deepest regard for John Paul II and Benedict XVI, and von Balthasar, Hans von Balthasar. Even though von Balthasar criticized him in one of his books, it was back when von Balthasar had only read, because von Balthasar died before these other books were out. He had only read Violence and the Sacred and Things Hidden, and there were some questions about the word sacrifice and so on and so forth. And René, as you know,
Repented
of that
after meeting
oversight.
Father.
Yeah, he said, you know, René said, when I came to the United States, I didn't realize how Protestant the environment was, and so I picked up these Protestant reflexes.
Right.
And he was not Catholic in a sectarian sense. I mean, he would, you know, but at the same time, he realized that he caught from his environment, he caught a kind of anti-sacramental ethos.
Right.
So he repented. So that's a side issue, but he did like von Balthasar, even though von Balthasar criticized his early work.
You mentioned Jean Paul II and Benedict. What do you think he would have thought about Pope Francis?
Well, one has to be diplomatic, I suppose. Let me put it this way: he was often heard to complain about the, the liberal priests and bishops and what they were doing
Right.
to the church and to the liturgy.
Sure.
He was a great lover of traditional liturgy.
Sure.
So you can extrapolate from that.
Right. 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 Though you're not an academic, Gil, but from everything I've heard from other people, your book, Violence Unveiled, is pretty difficult to read.
Well, that's my fault. I didn't try to make it that way, but anyway, it served a purpose.
Right.
It got, because it did get a lot of attention when it first came out. I had a sort of 15 minutes of fame as a result of it.
Right.
But
that was the book you were talking about. That was your first book that you were writing.
That's right.
Sack
Yeah.
with René and everything.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Do you have any plans now? Are you continuing doing work with René's work?
Well, yes, I had a book that came out in 2016 called God's Gamble, which is I use René's work and I connect it. Well, it's a rambling thing, but the full title is God's Gamble: the gravitational power of crucified love. And it's an apologetic in a way. It's an attempt to account for Christian faith, relying very heavily on René's work and on the work of the greatest theologian of the 20th century, Hans Urs von Balthasar. And so that was kind of a big work, that ranging thing, and I wanted to make sure I wrote that book before I died. I'm now working on another book, which is also drawing on René's work very much. And I can only give you the working titles, which may change. One of the working titles is from Tertullian: "The soul is naturally Christian."
That's good.
And it's a look at the nature of subjectivity and mimesis and how we're made and so on and so forth. So it's a book on the person, the mystery of the person.
What's your favorite book of his?
Well, I suppose it's Things Hidden.
Wow.
Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, because it's just so rich.
Right.
I mean, it has so much depth, and not that I have it all marked up and so on and so forth, but if I were to pick it up and reread it, I would learn so much. I have reread it, but if at any given time I'd pick up that book, I'd learn so much.
Right.
That's true of his other books too. Even his first book, at least the first book I think that was in English, I think it's his first book, Deceit, Desire, and the Novel.
Deceit, Desire, and the Novel.
So it's a little book, but it's beautiful, and all his work is there in embryo.
Right. Yeah. He always claimed that hermetic desire is a very simple concept, and then it branches out and gets more complicated. But the embryo, it's a very simple concept, but you can see it at work in anthropology, in literature, in the Bible, in psychology, psychiatry, and so on and so on. So, but I agree with you. Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World is perhaps the strongest. And as I do these interviews, most people endorse Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. So That seems to be the big one. What did you make of his last book, Battling to the End? That was pretty apocalyptic. What did you make of it?
Yeah, well, I thought it was an extraordinary book. I think, well, I'll tell you one thing. I was with René when he was working on that book, and this may tell you something. Now, I interpreted this. I have my own interpretation, but he said to me, again, I think we were having lunch, and he said, you know, I'm working on this book, and he said, and he had this gleam in his eye, and he said, it's going to be a very apocalyptic book, and he had a little devilish look, and here's how I interpret that. I know this is true of René's work, and it's also true of my modest little attempt to echo it. The mimetic theory, the theory of scapegoating, is easily assimilated into a moralistic, liberal, we should be nice, we should not scapegoat, shame on the scapegoaters. If we're going to scapegoat, let's scapegoat scapegoaters, and so on. And so the quick read of Girard, and I know this is true of my own work, people apply it in a way that's very moralistic and simple. And therefore they don't feel the ground shaking underneath them. What René is talking about is the power of the gospel. The earthquake that began when Christ died was the beginning of something that would. So it's either we learn to live generous, selfless, giving, caring lives, or we're going to bring the whole world down around us. So René, in Things Hidden, I think wanted to underscore that. And I think he knew it was his last book, and he wanted to say, look, this is serious business.
You mean Battling to the End, not Things Hidden?
Yes.
Battling to the End. Yes.
Battling to the End, yeah. That this is serious business. And so that little gleam he had in his eye when he said, I'm going to write a very apocalyptic book, I think it meant I'm going to write a book that will not be easily assimilated by the moralizing liberal world. They will, it's. I'm sounding a little too combative when I talk about the liberal world, but you understand what I'm saying.
Yeah.
It's very easy to make these sort of moral judgments, differentiations, and it's very easy to come out on top of those things when you do, and you forget about the most important thing of all. René would, the most important thing of all is original sin. Right. It's not. We didn't do away with it. We didn't get over it. It's there. So the idea of now we have this theory that's going to make it possible for us to, leave this old system behind and carry on. Well, we can carry on, but we better carry on, in the path of Christ, or else we're going to be at each other's throats. So anyway, that's what I think. That's why I think he had a certain gleam in his eye when he was working on that book.
Do you think the book gives any solution to this apocalypse?
I think the solution goes back to that first day I met him, when he said, maybe we should begin with personal sanctity.
That's a tough one.
That's a tough one. Yeah. Well,
But now, Gil, I want to know, what does that mean? Translate that to me. What does that mean? How do you get personal sanctification?
well, you're asking the wrong man. If you want to ask me about, original sin, I'm your guy. Personal sanctity. But I do. You know, it's to feel the attraction. Uh, to feel the attraction of a Christ-like existence,
Yeah, yeah,
and to allow the operation of grace, to give space for
yeah.
the operation of two things: grace and providence.
And providence?
And providence.
Providence.
Trust in providence. You know, we don't have to make everything happen. You know, one of the great things that Hans Urs von Balthasar said, the greatest theologian, I mean, he wrote thousands and thousands and thousands of pages of the most incredible and erudite theology. But one thing he said, which is so powerful, was, and this is from a long time ago, and I'm simplifying it, but he said, all sin, breaks down to impatience. If you think about the Garden of Eden,
Yeah,
you know, God had in mind to lead them, you know, into the promise in His own time, and they jumped at it. They grasped for it because they were impatient. And
yeah,
so, to trust providence, it doesn't mean we sit back, because you know providence prompts us to do something.
yeah,
But anyway, so I don't want to get too long-winded, but I think providence is providence and, you know, personal sanctity, grace, providence, and personal sanctity.
very good. Okay. Now you're interpreting Girard.
Yeah, there you
There we
go.
go. That's a concrete interpretation. Very
Yeah,
good. Excellent.
very
Very
good.
good.
Yeah,
Okay. So thank you so much for taking the time to do this interview and conversation on René. Gil, it was good to see you. And
it's very nice to see you, Babak, and to see that smile on your face that I remember so well over all these years later. I really, it's very, very pleasing to connect again.